Welcome to this session on sunspots and solar activities, which have some important relations with the weather. In the recent newspaper reports, you might have seen that some of the government agencies of the USA have issued some warnings of impending disruption of power grids or communication systems if some of the increase in sunspot activity as noticed in the early years and now predominantly being noticed in August, September of 2025 is found to peak, which was earlier predicted in November 2024 as a sunspot peak, whereas here now the sunspot peak has been shifted to 2025 and solar flares have been noticed and being estimated to be of higher intensity also. It's also doubted that the higher intensity part of the 100-year cycle will keep increasing so that the next few years more solar activity can be noticed. For all of you who are probably not very much familiar with the sunspots and what are these cycles of sunspots and solar flares and activities, etc., we will take a quick look at what are these sunspots and what are these sunspot cycles. Sunspots, scientifically speaking, are regions of reduced surface temperature on the sun's surface. So they look a little darker than the other part of the sun's surface. So the spots which are cooler areas in the sun's photosphere look as or be seen as spots darker than the surrounding area. So these are actually some sort of geomagnetic storms on the surface of the sun. The concentration of magnetic field on that area will reduce some heat in that area, and that area will look like a black spot. As you know, the sun reverses its polarity of north and south poles, the magnetic polarity, periodically, and therefore there are some magnetic disturbances continuously happening on the sun's surface. It is also aided by the other bodies or planetary bodies revolving around the sun or revolving around a particular barycenter of the solar system. These colder areas, I mean to say, will give some solar flares and some hot gassy ejections will come out of the area. And the sun's corona, which is called gas ejection from the corona, will reach the earth also and affect the cosmic radiation reaching the earth, because the pronounced ultraviolets and gases and the corona effects are definitely going to impede some of this cosmic radiation transfer from the outer space into Earth's atmosphere. Some of these sunspots are very large, some of them are not as large, but they are almost as the size of the Earth because the sun is much larger than the Earth in size. The scientific studies done by the various agencies and scientific institutions, astrophysicists, physicists, astrologers, astronomers, they all have come to the conclusion by various observances that there is a cycle of this sunspot activity. This sunspot activity will increase and decrease a long time. And around 11 to 13 years, there is a maximum, and then it slowly goes down, and then again comes back to a higher activity in 11 years. So there is a continuous activity which is increasing and decreasing in number of sunspots. And these, some of the scientists are attributing as causes for global climate changes because of the reason that the earlier sunspot cycles or sunspot minimas have given rise to colder climates of ice age, etc. So sunspot cycles do affect the climate on Earth is some belief, somebody don't agree to it. These are the pictures of the sunspot cycle. The first one at the top shows the raw data. The second one shows a smoothed value. This is from the International Society. And you can see from 1750 to 2000, they have plotted these sunspot activities. You can see there are some periodic ups and then downs and then ups and then downs, etc. like this, in this fashion. So there's a continuous up and down of these activities going on. Sometimes it is the activity, even the higher activity is also at a lower scale compared to the previous higher activity. So there is an overall minimum at some time like this. And there's an overall maximum at some time. So if you look at a curve which is modulated, you will get a curve like this on top. So there will be a smoother curve in this fashion. And you can see that these data has been recorded for around 2 centuries now. And here we will see approximately 60 years, near to about 60 years, there will be a pronounced peak or a pronounced trough in the overall modulated curve. See here in 1900 there is a low, in 1960 somewhere it is a high, and around 1870 or so there is a high, around 1780 or 1770 there is a high, so there is approximately of 60. We will talk about the 60 cycles, 60-year cycle in the later part of this presentation. Now these are some photographs. One of the photographs is from Soumyadeep Mukherjee, an astronomy photographer of the year 2022 award winner. He has taken a year on the sun. He has taken everyday photograph of the sun, given the same spot as an exposure, and slowly seeing that how the sunspot is continuously being seen for 1 year. And this is a very close-up photograph. You can see that there are some large ones, smaller ones, and longer ones, or in shape, long in shape, or very strange in shape, etc. There are some spots like this. We can talk about these spots and shapes, etc. further into the presentation. We have talked about the Brihat Samhita and the subjects dealt with in that book. And we have also seen quite a lot of weather information, observation of atmosphere, observation of animal plant behavior, and so many things being written in the Brihat Samhita. So among the various atmospheric observations, the chapter 3 of Brihat Samhita talks about observations of the sun's disk, as also various other phenomena around the sun like the perihelion and halos and so many other atmospheric activities. Now, there are about a dozen verses which talk about some ketus which make marks on the sun. So here Acharya Varahamihira says there are 33 types of ketus. Ketu actually in Sanskrit means a flag. So Ketu can be named as a flag or an insignia of a king. Like the king's flags are their marks, isn't it? Somebody has got a flag of a sun, or somebody has got a flag of Hanuman, and things like this are described in our Puranas and in our history. So the Dwaja or the flag actually shows a particular mark. So the Ketu here can be interpreted as a mark or a flag, not as the node of the moon called the Rahu and Ketu. So this is not that Ketu. There are many Ketus, he says. Who are the sons of Rahu? Means Rahu is considered to be the Asura in our Puranas. So some demoniacal force has given rise to this Ketus. This is the poetical way of expressing that there is something which can cause leave an effect on human beings. So these Ketus. It says they affect the sun and taint it. So it leaves marks on the sun. Normally sun we are considering always as a very bright object. In the moon we can see some taints. But to the naked eye, for the normal man or a common man, sun is flawless, sun is completely bright. But there are, for the keen observer, an astronomer or an astrologer, he can always use some filters to see the sun's disk even while it is bright and see whether there is any marks on the sun's disk. So today, as per modern science also, we use many telescopes which are having filters which filters ultraviolet and infrared and make it blue, and you can see things like what we normally watch eclipses with. Such type of glasses can be used. So you can use some glasses which can filter the light, and then you can see the sun's disk. So here the Acharya says the Ketus will affect the sun and taint it. And by looking at their shapes, position and color, one can predict the effect on nature. By looking at the color and the positions, like we saw in the previous slide, I showed you the picture, which is from the modern astronomers' observatories, that there are spots which are differing in shapes and differing in size also. So you can see that the Acharya here says you can look at their positions, their shapes, and their color, and each of those types will leave some effect on nature. And what are the effect on the nature? He says disturbance of the water courses. Basically means that rivers, flooding of rivers or drying of rivers or things which are not normally seen by other atmospheric portents. Dusty storms, unseasonal events of flowering and plant behavior. Unseasonal events of plant life and animal life behavior is actually the one thing which we are noticing nowadays due to global warming, etc., or climate change. Birds and wildlife getting affected with the changing pattern of sunlight. Now, normally we are not able to see any sunspot. We don't know whether sunlight is coming in, changing, but sensitive wildlife or sensitive plant life can detect even minor changes in the sun's radiation, and therefore they can exhibit some changes in their behavior. This the Acharya notices and says that this Ketu's cause effect on nature. Now, it further goes on to say that the Ketus, according to time and shape, will do the following effects, other than what he has already told. Reduce the capacity of rain clouds, reduce the cloud formation, cause drying of rivers, which he has already mentioned, that the disturbance of water courses, and change crop pattern in places. So the climate change, which we are now talking about so much in our modern times, about carbon dioxide in modern times and so many things. Crop pattern changing, plant life behavior changing, etc., has been noticed in the past also sometimes, probably because of this sunspot activity. Then for some specific descriptions, we see here some verses. And the Ketu is a Kilaka. When it is a nail-shaped Ketu, it will cause drought. So here we have earlier said that according to the shape, they will cause some examples are being given here. If Ketus look like sparks of fire, that there are flares, that means there will be suffering. There will be suffering means there are weather changes happening. The Ketus appearing white, red, yellow or black shall bring suffering to the four Varnas. Now, see, our ancient society has very much deep rooted in the Varnasrama system, the Hindu society. Because the Varnas are divided, the society is entirely divided according to the trades which they practice. There are teachers, there are priests, there are soldiers, there are merchants, there are service-oriented people. So this is how the society is divided with the various occupations. Now, the various occupations also perform certain dharmas on their various phases of life, like brahmacharya, garhastya, vanaprastha, etc., where householders are supposed to perform certain duties and the students are supposed to perform some duties. People who have already reached their old age are supposed to perform certain duties according to our Sanatana Dharma principles. So the four Varnas have to perform their duties correctly. The four ashramas have to perform their dharmas correctly for the sustenance of the society. If the teachers or the educators fail to perform their duty, knowledge will not be transmitted to students, and the next generation will get spoiled. If the yodhas or the warriors do not protect the country, there will be danger from enemies. If the commercial people do not perform their trade well, there will be cheating, there will be mistrust among people. So in this way, the Varnasrama is maintained in our society in the past. Here, the Acharya says the four Varnas will get affected in the performance of their duties by these four colors of the sunspots respectively. A single large spot will cause famine. This obviously looks like the modern thinking that if there is a large sunspot ejecting the corona, and there will be effect on the crops. Now, I have already told you that there are more than a dozen verses in the third chapter of the Brihat Samhita. They are all written in very, very poetic style. Like, for example, one of the verses here says, even rishis reduced to a skeleton by starvation give up their pious course of life. That means rishis are considered to be very rigid on their principles of maintaining their routines in their anushtanas, in acharnas. But even them, they can be affected by reduced to a skeleton by starvation. That means a famine will come into the country, and a hungry man cannot perform his religious duties well. And it says another place, with their eyes dimmed with tears, it is talking about people. With their eyes dimmed with tears shall proceed to some other lands with great difficulty. That means they will search in uh, other lands where some food can be available. So this is definitely a description of a great famine. When the Ketus of specific description appear, it talks about the specific description of the Ketus and talks in this fashion very poetically. Now, because of these poetical verses and some obscure languages being used in our ancient literature, we have missed some of these points where the scientific principles are given here. And these have been forgotten also because of foreign invasion and alien cultures dominating our education system and so many things. Therefore, we have lost the uh, idea of a sunspot. Uh, Now, the astrologers also don't talk about sunspots and all now. It's very clear that the reference to these verses are of sunspots because I already gave you some introduction to the sunspots and then described the sun's disk and the kilakas and the ketus, etc. So you can easily deduce that the Acharya speaks about sunspots only here. Varahamihira has lived in the 5th century somewhere, 400 CE somewhere around 400 of the Christian era. And in his book, in the preface or not in the first chapter itself, he talks about he has compiled many ideas from the previous acharyas. And Garga is one of the acharyas whom he is following very meticulously. Therefore, it is obvious that acharyas before him must have also transmitted some information to him about the sunspots. So the Hindu astronomers definitely must have known about the sunspots at least 100 years before Christ. Now you see, nowhere in the world, in scientific literature, in astronomy books or in astrophysics books, you will find that an Indian work is available where some sunspots have been discovered some time back, although not a very scientific treatise has not been given or a journal article has not been published by an Indian. But very, very long back itself, somebody has noticed the sunspots and documented them. So in utter ignorance of these facts of the Brihat Samhita or the Gargida Samhitas before it, or as a deliberate attempt to black out any Indian knowledge from the Western world, Westerners have recorded that these sunspots were first observed by Galileo Galilei, Christoph Steiner, and their contemporaries in 1600. So I'm just quoting here an information which I have downloaded from the Rice University website. In the West, study of sunspots began after the telescope was brought into use in 1609. Galileo and Thomas Harriot were the first to observe sunspots. First to observe sunspots with telescopes around the end of 1610. Now, whether Acharya Varahamihira used some form of an instrument like a telescope, we do not know. But he has documented there are sizes, shapes, etc. for the sunspots. Johannes and David Fabricius and Christoph Scheiner observed them in March 1611. Johannes Fabricius published his books De Maculis in Sole Observatis, which means on the spots observed in the sun, in 1611. So before 1600, nobody knew about sunspots, is what the Western theory says. But we are pointing out from Brihat Samhita, around 500 years, 1000 years before that, somebody has written about sunspots. Now, I'm quoting something from an article by Soumitra Mukherjee. The article is titled Extraterrestrial Influence on Climate Change. Now, Dr. Mukherjee says, although the sun's output is stable and there are possible impacts on the climate by sun's radiation is not accepted, the solar constant varies. In the later part of the 19th century, there were many claims of newfound connection between sunspots and climate. The announcement by amateur astronomer Heinrich Schwabe in 1843 that sunspots come and go in an apparently regular 11-year cycle. So this 11-year cycle was noticed by Heinrich Schwabe. But we will talk about this 11-year etc. cycle in another portion of this presentation. And you will see that some of our older astrology principles do recognize this 11-year cycle. So what followed was a flood of reported correlations, not only with the local and regional weather, but with crop yields, human health, and economic trends. So what he says is, after Heinrich Schwabe declared that there was a 11-year cycle for the sunspots, other observers on Earth, other observers about climate, about regional weather, about crop yields, etc., they all correlated this subject with what is happening on the crops, what is happening on the weather, etc. And then came out with a lot of information saying that this thing, what you are talking about, sunspot cycle, has something to do with weather and there has something to do with crops. So look at it here. I have seen every 10th year something is happening. So such information came out. From that, Dr. Mukherjee says that there is some extraterrestrial influence on the climate change. After more than a century of controversy, as there is a debate as to whether the solar variability has any significant amount on the climate change. And he says the present work attempts to establish a new hypothesis on stars and Earth atmospheric interaction. So his entire paper, The Extraterrestrial Influence on Climate Change, later he wrote some books also on it. It has opened up a new dimension to the subject of climate change and crop patterns and unseasonal variations of climate by linking it with solar activity. Now I would like to present something more from other sources. That the National Weather Service website, NOAA, the USA agency, this website has certain information about sunspot activity and weather. Here it says, research shows evidence that Earth's climate is sensitive to very weak changes in the sun's energy output. And this weak changes of sun's energy output over a time frame of decades and centuries. Now, times of maximum sunspot activity are associated with very slight increase in the energy output from the sun. Ultraviolet radiation increases dramatically during high sunspot activity. which can have a large effect on the Earth atmosphere. And the converse is also true during the minimum sunspot activity. So basically what the information here says is, the energy output from the sun reaching the Earth shows some minor amount of changes, very slight, in the periods when sunspot activity is higher or lower. But the Earth and the life on Earth is very sensitive to these changes. Therefore, the plant life or the nature, other forces of nature can exhibit some changes, can exhibit some behavior which causes change due to the energy received from the sun or the change in energy received from the sun. While examining the Earth on a global scale and over long periods of time, it is certain that solar energy output does have an effect on Earth's climate. Now, this is something like a new discovery. It is not a new discovery. In general, all of us believe that solar energy output, the light received from the sun, does have a significant impact on how life is carried out on Earth. Here the website here says, however, there will always be a question to the degree of such effect due to terrestrial and oceanic interactions on Earth. Now, the question here says it is just leaving it a little bit open, just to not to give everything to sun's change, because you cannot say that the sun is our God and therefore the God is determining the life on Earth, etc. Therefore, you must say that no, there are many other factors other than sun. Yes, there are many other factors other than sun. For example, the amount of carbon dioxide that which we emit from automobiles and industries are not so much in the past. So there must have been some influence of them on the climate. So we are not ruling it out. But while talking about carbon dioxide or other factors of global warming or the ozone layer or freon gas in your refrigerator and all those factors, you should not forget that the sun is the prime life giver, and sun's radiation, if it alters even to a minuscule extent, will cause some changes on Earth. This is the idea behind giving this statement. Therefore, the star-sun influence on Earth atmosphere is now established. This is also actually a quote from Dr. Soumitra Mukherjee only. Sometimes it is long-term change, otherwise it has been observed as episodic events. So the star-sun influence on the Earth atmosphere has a certain, in fact he has done some studies on earthquakes and the effect of earthquakes on other parts of the other type areas of the Earth, etc. Now, you see this, we are now trying to study sunspots, the sunspot cycles, and the scientists are doing some research on this and finding out or trying to establish that there is some relation to climate and weather with solar activity. So it is surprising to see that the solar activity and the relation to climate was known to our ancient Indian astrologers. So by looking at the Brihat Samhita or some other works, Therefore, we can only wonder that they should have done some research on this long back, long back. There should have been research done by people on this. How all those results of the research has been lost, and the world has suffered because of such information has been lost, is only a matter of pity. Now you see here in the last slide I showed you in the Prasamhita, the unseasonal change of plant and animal behavior is given as part of the sunspots effects. So the unseasonal change of behavior is plant and animal behavior is what we are now talking about, global warming and climate change. Now we will look at some effects on this earth from the solar cycles and also their relation to the slow moving planets. Do Saturn and Jupiter influence the weather? We have seen in the last 2-3 lessons which I have presented that according to the Samhitas and as well as by correlation with some of our 200-year rain data, we are apparently seeing some relationship with the planetary positions and the weather. Now we particularly see Saturn and Jupiter because they are very slow moving planets and we can observe their movement over longer time, longer period, effect of their movement over a longer period of time on Earth. The Earth's distance from the Moon and Sun do not vary anywhere near as much relatively as its distance from Jupiter in particular. This sentence actually looks a little tricky, but it is not very complicated. It actually means that the Earth distance from the Moon and the Sun are not as much as that of Earth from Jupiter. And the distances from the Earth to the Sun and the Earth to the Moons keep changing over the year because the elliptical orbits are there. Therefore, the elliptical orbit has got an aphelion and a perihelion, what you call as the shorter axis of the ellipse and the longer axis of the ellipse. So there will be some distance, there will be some difference in distance while it goes around the Sun or the Earth. So sometimes it will be closer, sometimes it will be farther away. And the Earth and the Sun variation is around 3% or so with reference to the distances. The highest, the farthest distance and the shortest distance are only within 3% of the average distance. Similarly, the Moon and the Earth has also got around 14% or so of the average distance will change. However, Jupiter is such a longer distance, but its elliptical motion compared to the elliptical motion of Earth and Moon and the Sun are far different. Well, actually, Jupiter is not revolving around the Sun center. No, it is revolving around the barycenter of the solar system. Because the resultant masses have got a center of mass slightly shifted from the center of the Sun. Therefore, the distance change over the year while it goes around in its aphelion and its perihelion could be as much as 50 to 60% of the average orbital distance. So Jupiter, even though farther away, is much larger than the Moon. And its relative motion towards and away from the Earth magnifies the changes in the gravitational acceleration. Is one principle. This is, I had taken it from some scientific article only. So the gravitational acceleration which is imparted on the Earth by Jupiter is larger than what is imparted by the Moon. The Moon itself causes tidal changes on the Earth, we know. So Jupiter's gravitational acceleration contribution is also there on Earth. Now when Saturn is going around, and when Saturn is opposite to Jupiter and pulling away, the effect of gravity from Jupiter will reduce to a certain extent, because it is true for Saturn also. Because of its larger mass and larger distance, there is some effect on the gravitational pull of the Jupiter from Saturn. Now, since the orbital periods of Sun and Jupiter are different, when they are opposite to each other, they are pulling in opposite direction. But as they go slowly away from each other, closer to each other, and slowly the gravitational pull by Saturn on the gravitational field of this Jupiter will reduce to somewhat extent. And after around 15 years or so, near about 20 years, they will become conjunct, we have seen. After around 15 years, both of them will pull together. So they will put a cumulative effect of gravitational pull on the Earth and the Sun. And after about 30 years later, 15 years later, they will go opposite, and then after 30 years later, Jupiter and Saturn will be aligned again. So this goes around. In the last class also I talked about that every 20 years the Jupiter gets conjunct, etc. And then a 60 year, at the 60th year, they come back to the same position. When they come back to the same position 60 year, there forms a 60-year cycle. And there is a theory here. The sunspots appear to correlate as they will be caused by variation in the planetary magnetic field. Because in the first slide also I showed you in the sunspots, there is a reduction and increase of the overall envelope of the sunspot cycle in a 60-year period. Now there is a principle called cosmoclimatology, which was actually propounded by Hendrik Swansmark. A lot of controversy was generated after he proposed a hypothesis. In cosmoclimatology theory, Swansmark says that the cosmic radiation reaching the Earth, if it is affected, will influence cloud formation and their rain-bearing capacity. So he talks about a 940-year cycle, because he studied the cycle of the sunspots over the period of 1645 to 1700. There is a minimum, and then there is a cyclic variation. So he called this 940-year cycle as Eddy cycle. It is named after Jack Eddy, who studied the mountain minimum. I will show this mountain minimum, etc. in the next slide. So within this 940 years, there are many 60-year cycles. So the large envelope of a 940-year cycle has got smaller modulating wave of a 60-year cycle. During these subcycles, the sun's activity varies. So every 11th year, there is a sunspot activity increase and decrease. And that overall activity change is 60 years. And such 60-year cycles are there in a total 940-year cycle. This is the idea which Sunspot brought out in his theory. And by studying the low and high of the activities in this cycle, he has correlated it with the heating and the ice ages and brought out a thinking or a hypothesis saying that these cycles have got a relation with ice ages and heating and warming of the earth. So, and in this, Jupiter and Saturn play a role in changing the magnetosphere of the earth. That means by the argument which we saw in the previous slide, that Jupiter and Saturn, as they go in and they complete their 60-year cycle, there will be changes in the magnetosphere of the earth, which ultimately changes the climate on earth. Is his theory. Now, modern scientists do not accept this in toto or even reject it. Vast majority of the scientific community believe that correlation between the cosmic rays and temperature is not strong enough to be considered as a primary driver of climate change. So they still say that today what is happening is not attributed to what you are saying. However, your study on the previous minima and something which has come out of the ice ages, etc., might look okay. However, today we are in a place, in a situation where carbon dioxide and industrialization are creating so much of global warming, and I cannot accept your cosmoclimatology fully. But in the Hindu astrology, you see, the cycles of years, the samvatsaras marked in the Panchangam, itself is a 60-year cycle. And using the 60-year cycle only, we generate the cloud numbers, the Varshaphala, and so many things. And how this 60-year cycle is formed? It is started from one spot of the Jupiter's cycle. So there are 5 cycles of Jupiter or Guru as it goes around. And the moon and the Saturn and Jupiter coming together and separating each other. This is another cycle. So using this cycle, we are saying when Saturn comes back, or the planetary position approximately returns back to its original position, is 60 years. And therefore we start with Prabhava, Vibhava, etc. for 60-year cycle. Incidentally, you see the Jupiter's orbital period is 11.8 years, which is also approximately equal to the sunspot cycle. So the sunspot and the Jupiter and the Saturn and the 60-year cycle, the Prabhavadi year cycle, all of them seems to be having some relationship which can cause climatological changes, and for which the ancient Indian astrologers propounded their own poetical way of telling things, but not fully documenting it. However, it seems that the Jupiter-Saturn cycle and climatology was known to our ancient astronomers. Now, we talked about the cosmoclimatology, in which we said Maunder minimum, etc., and a 940-year cycle, and things like this. So we are here. See, the modern minimum actually happened between 1650 and 1700, where the sunspot activity was very minimum. And then it went up around 1760 or 1760, 1775 or something. It went up to a maximum. Then there was a minor minimum, and then it keeps on going in this fashion. Like this modern minimum is there and goes up and down. There's a Dalton minimum, and there's a modern maximum. Because now in around 2000 years, 2080 and all, the two maximum have come. And 2025, another maximum is now coming. And this is now contributing to climatological changes as recorded in those years. Now, there's over 900 years. If you just work backwards and forwards, you get a 900-year large cycle where a maximum can be obtained and a minimum cycle can be obtained. This is the what has been proposed by the cosmoclimatological theorists. Panchangam uses a 60-year cycle, is what I have already told you in the previous discussion. Now we have also seen some correlation of Saturn-Jupiter union and opposition to rainfall, which I have shown you in the 200-year rainfall data in the last session. Now my request to all of you who are looking at this video and my other videos, to put a little thought to this and either do your own studies on this astrological principles, help me in conducting some more studies on this, assist me, and let us build a much more robust weather forecasting system using these astronomical effects or planetary effects on Earth, so that large part of the society can be benefited by our work. Now I present another angle to the climate change and weather pattern and the effect of Saturn and Jupiter on the climate and weather. This work I have taken with due respect to Ian Wilson, who is in the Liverpool Daytime Astronomy Center. Dr. Wilson says the North Atlantic and Pacific decadal oscillations are related to changes in the Earth's rotation rates or the Earth's length of day. You know that the Earth is not exactly rotating in 24 hours. Slightly different, and every year or in some years the Earth's rotation rate changes because of the geomagnetic or the magnetosphere of the complete solar system is shifting because of the various planetary movements. Now, this PDO is what we are using in the modern weather forecasting techniques. This is called the El Nino and La Nina. So we will find in newspapers that this year El Nino activity is higher, therefore there will be monsoon, etc. Even Indian weather forecasters use the El Nino because the Pacific is a very large water body and it affects the entire world. Or North Atlantic oscillations also they use. But the more predominant dipole for Indian monsoon forecast is actually the Indonesian dipole. However, we are also using the PDO and NAO in our forecasting. The observation by Dr. Wilson is whenever the PDO is positive, and Earth's deviation from its length of day has got some relationship, and you can find it very clearly by observing these years. And he says there must be some underlying physical process that connect the relative motion of the four Jovian planets to a factor that can influence the rotation rate of the Earth. So Mars, Venus, Saturn and Jupiter, these four planets are definitely putting some influence on the Earth's magnetic field or the magnetosphere of the Earth, which is creating a change in the PDO, his observation. And he says, we conclude that most likely candidate for the underlying physical, there must be some underlying physical process, and the main candidate for this thing is the precession rate of the line of nodes of the lunar orbit. That means the Rahu Ketu's precession rate, the shift in their annual orbits is precession. From there, the ecliptic and the equator cross each other. That is the point of Rahu and Ketu. This is not the line of node. So that line of node has got a precession. That precession and the relative orbital period of Venus, Earth, Mars and Jupiter are going to definitely affect this length of day on Earth, is Dr. Wilson's contention. So you see here, Rahu, Ketu, Jupiter and Mars affecting the climate has been talked about by our Samhita scholars, by our Samhita acharyas. So our acharyas say Rahu, Ketu, and I have also shown in one of my last slides that Rahu's influence on Jupiter causes drought. Therefore, the Rahu, Ketu and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn we have already seen. Jupiter and Saturn, all of them put together are going to create a weather change, is what we learn from this extract from Dr. Wilson. Now I am going to quote some sections of the Farmer's Almanac of the USA. The Farmer's Almanac says that their forecasting methodology is from the formula devised by Robert Thomas, who believed that Earth weather was influenced by sunspots. And the almanac says, we predict the weather trends by comparing solar patterns and historical weather conditions with current solar activity, for which we do three things: solar science, study of sunspots, climatology, prevailing weather patterns, and the study of the atmosphere. And they say, we are claiming almost 80% accuracy of our forecasts. Although we accept that the mysteries of the universe are so high that predicting the weather with total accuracy is not possible, but we are getting at least 80% accuracy. Therefore, like I appealed earlier, all my viewers, I make another appeal to look at all the atmospheric phenomena and try to see the weather, even without the principal usage of a cloud map or a radar. Thank you for listening. I will upload some more videos on the same subject later, and I have already uploaded some videos earlier. But this particular subject of sunspots can be independently seen by anyone. Thank you very much.